How to Build Wealth Without Losing Your Merit. Buddhist Teachings on Right Livelihood. There's a common assumption that Buddhism and money don't mix, that a spiritual path calls for renouncing ambition, and that anyone seriously interested in practice should treat wealth with suspicion. But this misreads what the Buddha actually taught. He never instructed lay followers, the householders who worked, raised families, and ran businesses, to avoid prosperity. What he offered instead was guidance on how to pursue it. A set of principles that let a person build a comfortable life without corroding the very qualities that make life worth living: honesty, compassion, and peace of mind. These teachings appear scattered throughout the Agama and Nikaya sutras, in conversations the Buddha had with merchants, farmers, and ordinary householders who wanted to know how to live well in the world, not just how to withdraw from it. Read together, they form something close to a complete philosophy of livelihood, one that treats money not as an enemy of spiritual life, but as a tool that can either deepen your suffering or support your well-being, depending entirely on how it's earned, held, and used. What follows are 8 of the central principles drawn from that teaching. 1. Choose a livelihood that doesn't harm. The starting point of any Buddhist approach to wealth is the choice of occupation itself. The Buddha specifically named 5 trades he urged lay followers to steer away from: dealing in weapons, trafficking in human beings, including the exploitation of women's bodies, selling intoxicants, trading in the meat of living creatures, and producing poisons. At first glance, this list might look like an arbitrary catalog of bad jobs, but the underlying logic is consistent and worth sitting with. Each of these trades generates income by amplifying someone else's suffering. A weapons dealer profits when conflict escalates. A trafficker profits from another person's captivity. A seller of intoxicants profits from addiction and the family breakdowns that often follow it. None of these are incidental side effects. They are, in a sense, built into the business model. The Buddha's point wasn't that money earned this way is somehow unclean in a ritual sense, but that a livelihood structurally dependent on others' pain keeps a person locked into a cycle of causing harm, whether or not they intend to. He also made clear that this isn't only about what you do with your own hands. Encouraging, arranging, or turning a blind eye while someone else does the harming carries the same weight. A person who merely finances or facilitates such work isn't exempt from its consequences. The teaching asks something more demanding than simply staying technically uninvolved. It asks for genuine unwillingness to profit from suffering, wherever that suffering originates. Practically speaking, people who build their livelihood this way often carry it with them in ways that surface later. In strained relationships, in restless nights, in a nagging sense that something is owed. The law of cause and effect, as the tradition describes it, isn't a cosmic ledger kept by an external judge. It's closer to a description of how actions ripple outward and eventually circle back. No one escapes that by simply not getting caught. 2. Keep your word. If choosing a harmless trade is the foundation, honesty is the load-bearing wall. Throughout history, no shortage of people have built lasting prosperity on nothing more complicated than a reputation for keeping their promises. Word gets around. A merchant known for fair dealing draws customers who return year after year and recommend them to others. Trust, once established, becomes its own form of capital, one that compounds in ways that no clever marketing campaign can replicate. The alternative path is familiar too. Counterfeit goods, inflated claims, contracts quietly broken, corners cut where no one is watching. This kind of business can generate real money, sometimes quickly. But the Buddha's observation, echoed by centuries of practical experience since, is that wealth built on deception rarely holds. It's wealth grown from the branches rather than the roots, to use an image common in the tradition, impressive to look at, but without the deep structure needed to withstand a hard season. Sooner or later, the branch snaps. There's also a subtler cost that has nothing to do with getting caught. Someone who has built their fortune through dishonest means tends to carry a particular kind of unease, a low hum of anxiety about exposure, about karma, about the people they've wronged. Even if the business survives and the money keeps flowing, that unease doesn't disappear on its own. By contrast, someone whose wealth was earned honestly, however modestly, tends to sleep more easily. Their prosperity doesn't require them to keep track of lies or manage the risk of discovery. This is, in its own way, a form of wealth that money can't purchase after the fact. 3. Never stop learning. Technical competence in your chosen field is necessary, but far from sufficient. The Buddhist teaching on livelihood places real emphasis on ongoing learning, not simply mastering the mechanics of a trade, but cultivating the kind of broad, discerning wisdom that lets a person see further than the immediate transaction in front of them. This matters because markets, industries, and circumstances shift constantly. A business that thrives today can be undercut by a competitor, a new technology, or a change in regulation tomorrow. Someone who stops learning the moment they feel competent is, in effect, betting that nothing around them will ever change, a bet that rarely pays off over a long career. The alternative is to stay a student indefinitely, studying successful examples closely enough to understand why they worked, and studying failures, including your own, closely enough to understand what went wrong and why, rather than simply attributing bad outcomes to bad luck. This kind of learning isn't only about protecting existing wealth from risk, though that matters. It's also about the quality of judgment a person brings to every decision they make. Someone with real, hard-won understanding of their field tends to notice problems early, when they're still small and manageable, rather than only recognizing them once they've become expensive crises. In this sense, ongoing learning functions less like an optional professional habit and more like a form of insurance that a person carries inside their own mind. 4. Be diligent and persistent. There's a particular kind of restlessness that undermines many people's efforts to build wealth. The habit of abandoning one path the moment a better-looking one appears. Today, it's this business. A few months later, convinced something else offers a faster route, it's an entirely different venture. Layered on top of this is often an impatience for quick results, a desire to skip the slow, unglamorous middle stretch of any worthwhile undertaking and arrive directly at success. The Buddha's teaching here is blunt. This pattern tends to end in wasted years and, often, in losing what little ground had already been gained. Genuine progress. In a business, a career, or any long-term project, requires committing to a direction and then working through the inevitable difficulties that arise, one at a time, rather than treating each obstacle as a signal to start over somewhere else. This isn't a claim that hard work guarantees success. The tradition doesn't promise that. What it does claim, with more confidence, is the reverse, that a lack of diligence all but guarantees failure. Effort doesn't purchase outcomes directly, but it's the precondition without which outcomes rarely arrive at all. A person who commits to a sound direction and works it patiently, adjusting as needed without constantly changing course, builds something that can actually withstand pressure. A business or career with real roots rather than one still searching for solid ground. 5. Practice saving. Money mismanaged has a way of turning against the person who earns it. The Buddha described this vividly. Wealth that should serve as a loyal servant, supporting a stable and dignified life, can just as easily become something closer to a venomous snake, biting the hand that carelessly wields it, when it's poured into empty pleasures, harmful habits, or the gamble of trying to multiply it overnight through games of chance rather than sustained effort. The remedy he offered is refreshingly concrete, not merely a vague call to be careful with money. Set aside roughly a quarter of what you earn, he suggested, as a reserve for times of genuine need: illness, misfortune, unexpected obligation. The remaining 3/4, spent thoughtfully, is enough to sustain a comfortable and stable life. Notice what this advice does not say. It doesn't call for extreme austerity, for treating every expense as a moral failing, or for hoarding money out of fear. The goal is balance. Living neither so lavishly that nothing remains for the future, nor so tightly that the present becomes joyless. There's also a relational dimension worth naming here. Money saved wisely and spent with intention rather than impulse can become a way of honoring the people who matter most. Setting some aside for aging parents, for instance, even in small gestures, tends to mean more than its dollar value suggests. Saving, in this reading, isn't primarily about accumulation for its own sake. It's about giving yourself, and the people who depend on you, a buffer against the inevitable rough patches that life brings. 6. Be content with what you have. Among all 8 principles, this one is perhaps the most frequently misunderstood, because on its surface it can sound like an argument against ambition itself. It isn't. The teaching, sometimes summarized as "contentment is the greatest wealth," makes a more precise claim: that someone who has everything but never feels satisfied is, in the way that actually matters, impoverished, while someone with relatively little, who has done their honest best and can rest in that, possesses something no amount of money buys directly. This isn't a license to give up striving, settle for less than you're capable of, or drift passively through circumstances you could actually improve. The Buddha was explicit that this teaching applies after genuine effort. Once you have worked diligently, applied what you've learned, and given a situation your honest best, contentment means releasing the compulsion to chase results that remain stubbornly out of reach. Without that release, ambition curdles into a kind of restless grasping that erodes judgment and, eventually, peace of mind. The trader who can't stop trading even when reason says to walk away, the entrepreneur who risks everything already built in pursuit of one more win. Practiced well, contentment functions as a kind of internal thermostat. It doesn't shut off effort or aspiration. It prevents those things from tipping into obsession. A person who has internalized this teaching can still work hard, still want to grow, still take reasonable risks. But they aren't owned by the outcome in the way someone chasing an ever-receding finish line tends to be. That distinction, subtle as it sounds, is often what separates a genuinely wealthy life from one that merely looks wealthy from the outside. 7. Share with those around you. A story attributed to the Buddha captures this principle memorably. Someone once told him they were too poor to give anything to anyone. His reply: "No one is so poor that they couldn't spare a single grain of rice for an ant." The point isn't really about ants or grains of rice. It's that generosity doesn't require surplus wealth as a precondition. It requires attention and willingness, which are available to almost anyone regardless of their bank balance. This reframes what giving actually means in a way that's easy to miss if you assume it only applies to the wealthy writing checks to charity. a meal shared with someone hungry, a cup of water offered to someone thirsty, a warm coat handed to someone cold, a visit paid to someone sick or struggling. These acts, however modest, carry weight precisely because they cost the giver something real, whether that's money, time, or simply the discomfort of showing up for someone else's hardship. The tradition suggests, somewhat counterintuitively, that a poor person's small act of generosity can carry more genuine merit than a wealthy person's large donation, precisely because of what it costs the giver relative to what they have. There's also a benefit that flows back toward the giver, distinct from any notion of cosmic reward. Reaching outward toward someone else's difficulty tends to pull a person out of their own isolation and self-absorption. It gives their life a kind of meaning that accumulation alone rarely provides. The teaching's final, sharper point is a warning. No matter how much wealth someone manages to gather, if they never learn to open their hands to the people around them, that wealth tends to dissolve eventually, like smoke. Sometimes literally, through mismanagement or misfortune, and sometimes more figuratively, in the sense that a hoarded fortune that touches no one else's life leaves remarkably little behind. 8. Give generously to build merit. The final principle addresses a question almost everyone eventually asks, in one form or another. Why do some dishonest, even cruel people seem to prosper effortlessly, while many honest, hard-working people struggle regardless of how diligently they try? The Buddhist answer rejects the idea of an external judge, a god or fate handing out fortune and misfortune according to some arbitrary system of favorites. Instead, it points to the law of cause and effect operating across a much longer time scale than a single visible lifetime. Today's comfort or hardship is described as the fruit of causes planted earlier, not always traceable within the span most people can observe. Whatever one makes of that longer causal claim, the practical instruction that follows from it is straightforward and doesn't require accepting every metaphysical premise to be useful. Cultivate the habit of giving, in whatever form actually fits your circumstances. The tradition names several forms this can take: material support for those in need, useful advice or teaching offered freely, protection or reassurance for someone afraid, and simple warmth or encouragement for someone who needs it. Wealthy practitioners are encouraged to give material support generously, but the teaching is careful to note that even someone with almost nothing can build merit. Through their labor, through a kind word, through showing up for someone in crisis when money isn't the relevant currency at all. This principle closes the circle back to where the whole framework began. Ethical livelihood, honest dealing, disciplined learning, sustained effort, careful saving, genuine contentment, and habitual generosity aren't 8 unrelated rules bolted together. They function as a single, coherent approach to living well with money rather than being quietly ruled by it. Taken as a whole, this teaching resists the idea that wealth and well-being exist on opposite sides of a ledger, where gaining one necessarily costs the other. What it offers instead is a more integrated picture: material success, pursued through honest work, tempered by contentment, and shared generously, becomes something that actually supports a settled mind rather than undermining it. The measure of a life well lived, in this view, was never simply the size of the fortune accumulated. It was always the quality of character with which that fortune was earned, held, and eventually let go of.